Okay, listen, this video has changed how I paint forever. So recently I've been getting a little fed up with my usual painting workflow. The step-by-step grind that I've been doing for a couple of years now has almost become a little boring to me. And so I decided it was finally time to revive this series, which has been dormant since episode 1. So welcome to our second ever technique tryout, where we look at the step-by-step techniques and workflows of some of our favorite artists. Unlike style studies, these videos are less about what they paint and more about how they paint it. So instead of looking at the end product, we're going to take a look at the process of how these artists create the look and feel of the amazing paintings that they create. And today we're going to look at another one of my all-time favorite artists, Abigail Diaz, also known as Serafleur art. This video was actually requested by two amazing viewers, Louise Porter and Regina Tenorio, and although I know you requested a style study on Serafleur art, I feel like there's just so much more I wanted to talk to you guys about the techniques that she uses. So I hope you enjoyed this video and find it helpful regardless. Stick with me. Okay, but thank you so much to Louise and Regina for requesting this video. As always, if you guys enjoy this video and find it helpful, then let me know by giving me a big thumbs up and leaving a comment below. Hit that subscribe button down below and notification bell so you don't miss a future upload on this channel. And now let's look at another technique tryout featuring Serafleur art. Abigail Diaz is a freelance digital artist from the Philippines who creates these gorgeous, ethereal fantasy character paintings that make me think of galaxies and mythology. She started painting in 2011, and although she went to university for a bachelor's degree in entrepreneurship, she eventually discovered a passion for painting instead. Hashtag relatable. She doesn't post on YouTube very frequently, and her last upload was from a year ago. However, while I initially had Abigail down for a style study, having watched a few speed paints she does have on there, I quickly realized that her workflow was very different to mine, and so I figured it would actually be more helpful for you guys if I shared her work with you in this format instead. And like I said, her YouTube videos are from over a year ago, but I did manage to find a video of her painting A2 from Nier Automata for a different channel, The Art of Mr. Sheep, our old friend. This one is from last October, so October 2020, so I'm gonna assume that is the best representation of her current painting techniques, and today's video is gonna be mostly based off of that one. One other thing I specifically wanted to mention was that she paints these holographic glittery effects. Now, I haven't found a single video where she actually demonstrates the exact steps on how to get that effect, but it's so beautiful and adds so much character to her work, I had to figure it out. And I'm delighted to tell you I figured out a way to create that holographic glitter effect. And although I'm sure Abigail's actual technique is way more efficient and just better, but listen, we're here to fangirl, and fan edits are almost never in the same league as the OG. Also, today we're going to paint the 10th sign of the zodiac, Capricorn, as part of my dark astrology series. As always, we'll talk about this a little later in the video. Okay, enough bants. Let's look at the 5 key steps to Serafleur art's workflow. So, as with all artists across time and space, Abigail of course starts with a sketch. However, unlike most artists who start with a rough then clean up their lines, Abigail actually does this a little differently, a little more intuitively. Instead of starting with a pencil brush, she actually grabs a pressure opacity round brush, aka what I like to call the magic brush. Download link in the video description, you're welcome. So instead of starting with the usual composition and construction lines and such, Abigail actually starts by outlining the silhouette of the character just freehand. I know, it's literally magic and I have no idea how she does that, but she does. Now, I am not at that level quite yet, and this is kind of a complex composition. So I did start with construction lines, which you can see in a low opacity layer underneath, but I have created a new layer on top, and I've gone ahead and done the magic brush silhouette. This step is mostly about making smudgy marks with a relatively big brush radius. By big, I mean that this brush is thicker than what you would normally use to sketch or create line art with. Right now, we're only placing down the location of all of our elements as opposed to their actual shapes and details. I actually found that this helps free the mind quite a bit, and that I was quickly putting down a whole bunch of elements that weren't on the original thumbnails in my sketchbook. Once I have the smudgy sketch down, I'm going to get rid of the sketchy layer underneath. We don't need that anymore. Next, Abigail goes in with a smaller detailed brush and a darker color and begins to refine the smudgies that she just put down. So I've gone ahead and created a new layer on top, and with a harder opaque brush and a darker gray, I'm going in and now creating those detailed shapes. One other thing I noticed is that Abigail doesn't get rid of the smudge layer at any point, nor does she draw every single line in the new detailed line art layer. She actually makes it so the smudgy sketch and the more refined line art work in tandem to create a slightly more dimensional, dynamic sketch. The first layer we put down creates almost some shading, while the second layer brings out the details. As you can clearly tell, I definitely enjoyed this step more than I've ever enjoyed putting down a sketch for a painting. So this step is pretty straightforward. With the sketch / line art in place, Abigail goes in and paints a bunch of initial flat tones in order to separate all the elements and materials in the painting using some solid base colors. One thing to remember here is that she generally uses the more shadowy tones as the base colors. This will come into play in the next step, so keep this in mind. So at this stage, I'm going in and painting some flats underneath my line art. Now in her speed paint, Abigail tends to freehand these flats, manually painting them in. But I personally prefer to use the pen tool and create selections and then fill them in with the paint bucket tool, because I don't use a screen tablet and it's kind of a challenge to get a flat base with smooth even edges with just a regular pen tablet. Or at least it is a big challenge for me. But however you prefer to do it, the key is to make sure you're using the shadow tones of each individual element and that your edges are neat. Next, she uses the gradient tool and a soft airbrush to create gradients within some of the flats. So we're keeping it fairly simple still, and the gradients are not going to be super dramatic at all. You'll see me use the gradient tool for the background elements, but for the character itself, I wanted a little more control, so I opted for the airbrush tool in the smaller areas. Abigail also adds little airbrush spots in the skin, particularly adding the shadows and saturated tones. For instance, adding a little redness around the nose and the cheeks, adding shadows to the eye socket, and so on. So just like we did with the sketch, this step is about placing all of those softer color and light shifts, just trying to map our way around the composition. One thing to always keep in mind is your light source. Abigail generally goes for a fairly diffuse key light from above the character, which is then balanced out with some rim and bounce lights. So that's the light setup I've gone for here, but again, we're focusing on the step-by-step process today, not the end product. So no matter what lighting setup you choose, the point is to keep that in mind while placing your soft shadows and saturated areas. The very first sharper details Abigail places are the highlights in the skin and then the hair. So like I mentioned earlier, she starts by placing the shadow tones down and then working her way up the value scale. This was like the first common thought process I found between her workflow and mine, and I mention this because I can tell you why this works. This is actually one of the best parts about digital painting, is the ability to start dark and work your way up to the lightest tones. In traditional art, you rarely have opaque enough paints or pencils or pastels to allow this order of placing the values. But the reason I always recommend starting with your shadow tone is because it helps you set a precedent for your values. Oftentimes when we start by painting the brightest tones, it's kind of hard to control how dark we want to go. Why? Because your eyes are not equipped to gauge darkness as accurately. The reason you're able to see the world around you right now is because light is bouncing off of objects and hitting your retina and triggering light receptors in the retinal surface. However, there isn't such a thing as darkness receptors in the eye. Like, the reason you can perceive darkness is because there is less light, but we're not equipped to actually quantify darkness as a property of its own. So when it comes to properly deciding how dark you want to paint your shadows, it is pretty much impossible to guess that based on your lighter tones. Your shadows are not an entity created by the light source. Instead, everything is always shadow until it is interrupted by light. So putting down the shadow tones first, Abigail is essentially setting a precedent for the natural tone of all the elements in her painting before the light hits them and changes their colors. I hope that made sense. So when we already have our shadowy gradients in place, we can go in and add confident, harder shapes with light, because as human beings, we know light. We understand how to brighten things up because that is literally how we see the world around us. Am I looking too deep into this? I feel like I'm looking too deep into this. But anyway, as you've been seeing on the screen, this step is all about brightening things up with some harder edge details. However, we're not yet placing the super sharp lines. Everything is still fairly soft and well blended. All we're doing at this stage is creating that dimension, taking a flat shadowy layer and turning it into three-dimensional forms. And with all of the first brighter areas in place, we're now going to grab the more dramatic tones and begin to add the smaller details. Again, we're not at specular highlight level yet, not even close. We're just going across the painting and incrementally tightening things up, taking everything from the soft, super blended gradients up to a more three-dimensional object with sharper highlights and shadows. So this is where you put in the details in the eyes, the lashes, the brows, the corners of the nose and the mouth, smaller clumps in the hair, and so on. In my specific composition, this was also where I began to tighten up the details in his hands, his tail and horns, and the floating corpse in the water, not to mention the more defined shapes in the clouds and the lightning bolt. So step 3, start to add in the slightly sharper details, turning the flat base into 3D elements with light and form. Okay, this is the part that made the biggest difference to how I paint, and I'm honestly so glad to have done this video, because not only has it helped my art, it's also kind of helped my mindset. So recently I was recommended the book Atomic Habits, and it is probably the best book recommendation that I've ever had because it teaches you a very important lesson. Tiny changes in how you do things can compound up to massive results. And through some strange synchronicity, this is exactly what I found Abigail does with her paintings. Because looking through her speed paints, I found that a couple of adjustment windows pop up on her Photoshop screen all the time, namely the hue saturation window and the levels adjustment menu. Basically, she makes tiny color and value adjustments as she goes along the painting, tweaking little things here and there. Now, you might think this isn't a big deal, but actually, having done that along the way here, I found that it genuinely makes a massive difference towards the end, and here is why. So normally I tend to leave the color and value adjustments for the very end of a painting. I even mentioned it in my finishing steps video. It has always been an important part of my workflow, but at the very end. But here's the biggest drawback of saving it for the end that I wish I'd known sooner. It is not at all flexible. Say for instance, I get to the end of a painting and realize that it is too dark and I need to bump up the brightness. If I've already rendered the whole painting out, I'm only going to be able to up the brightness on a surface level, in that all of the adjustments are only going to go on top of my already finished painting. And if I decide that it needs to be significantly brighter than what I've painted it to be, blowing up the exposure that much would actually cause some of the details to be completely lost. And this is the same even if you decide your piece is too bright and needs to be significantly darker or higher contrast. And once that happens, if you want to bring back some of those details, the only thing you can do at that point is to go back and paint them in all over again, and then rinse and repeat. Basically, you're trying to reshape clay that has already baked and dried out. Or for my makeup people out there, it's like trying to put a liquid highlighter on after you've powdered your entire face. Ugh. However, when I make these micro adjustments as I go along, I'm kind of baking the adjustments into the painting, and I'm able to then build on that. And that's exactly what Abigail does. Instead of making massive adjustments only towards the very end, she's essentially breaking it into mini adjustments and making that part of the process. It's kind of like reshaping the clay while it's still malleable, way more efficient, and you get a much better end product. This is also where she throws in a bit of rim light. If you don't know what that is, I highly recommend checking out my video about painting lights. I have it linked in the cards above right now. But even after the rim light is in, you'll see that she also color and value adjusts that, so it's not too overpowering nor too subtle. One other interesting step I saw Abigail use was the lasso selection. Now again, this is one of those things that I personally don't enjoy doing because I don't have a screen tablet, but she uses lasso selections to define hard edges, especially in the clothing where you want a little extra precision so that it looks machine designed and perfect. I did kind of use this trick with the scales on his tail, although what I did was paste in actual scale patterns, control-click them to select the outlines, and then paint it into the outlines. Basically a cheat to get around using the lasso tool, but you didn't hear it from me, okay? So, step number 4 is to make tiny adjustments along the way, and I promise you they add up in the end. Alright, this is the fun stuff you've all been waiting for, the final polish. There are 4 main elements that Abigail adds to her paintings towards the end. And again, a lot of this is speculation on my part, but this is where I'm going to show you how I got that holographic effect. But before we get into that, the first thing she does is create an overlay layer and add in some super bright pops of light. Not specular highlights, but rather the softer areas that directly catch the brightest of the key light. Next, she sharpens some of the edges while smudging others, and this is actually a cool and easy way to play with perspective. The closer something is to you, the sharper the detail that you can see in it. And when something is further away from you, it gets blurrier. And if you play with the contrast between sharpening and blurring, you can really cause an image to basically jump off of the screen. She then throws in the specular highlights, of which there are usually loads. We're not talking about the holographic stars quite yet, but rather the little specks of glitter, the shine in the eyes, the stars and floating lights in the hair and the background. There's a couple of things I noticed about these specular lights. First, Abigail makes sure to place them in the areas where there are no other sharp details, again pushing that contrast between sharp and blurry edges. And second, she likely then uses a sharpening filter on the specular highlights that cause them to almost have a bit of a dark bevel around them. Because this is so subtle, you probably don't notice it, but it basically creates a teeny weeny bit of darkness around the highlight, further pushing that contrast and making it really pop. If you use the Smart Sharpen filter and set the amount and radius super high, you should be able to achieve this effect. And finally, let's talk about that holographic effect. Now, this took me hours to figure out until I was able to standardize it, then replicate it on all of my already existing paintings before I even started working on this one. This is probably not how Abigail does it, but this is the closest that I could get. So there are 7 steps. I know, but once you try it out, it's so simple, you won't even want to do anything else ever again. So first, you're going to create a new gradient layer. You can either literally choose a gradient adjustment layer and then rasterize it, or you can manually paint or paste in a gradient like I've done here. In either case, we need to create a rainbow gradient layer. Ideally, you want the rainbow repeated several times all the way across the canvas. Next, you're going to create a very specific mixer brush. Grab the mixer brush tool and any brush tip shape, set the wet to 100%, turn the load down to as low as it will go, and turn the mix up all the way. Step number 3, you're going to smudge things around your rainbow with the brush. Just swirl everything around, pretend you're water marbling your nails or something. Make sure the colors are still separate though, you don't want that gross bunch of gray spots. I also suggest just saving this layer as an image for future use so you can skip all of this labor. Now, we're going to create a layer mask and paint it black so the layer disappears. Whatever we paint into the layer mask in white now is where the rainbow will appear, right? So now you can grab your stamp brushes that look like stars and glitter and all that cool stuff and carefully place the stars wherever you want the rainbow to appear. Oh, but it looks dull? That's because we've got 2 more simple steps to go. When you have all of your stars in place, you're then going to set this layer to linear dodge mode. Boom, it is now a holographic light gradient. If you feel like it's not bright enough, just duplicate the layer and it will be fine. And the final step, and this is optional, is to apply a smart sharpen filter, just like we did with the specular highlight, to really make the holographic stuff pop. And that's it. There's your finished hollow stars. So here is Capricorn, the 10th addition to my Dark Astrology series. Capricorn is a cardinal earth sign that signifies the change from autumn to winter. It is ruled by Saturn, which in many ways is the opposite of Jupiter, which rules the preceding sign, Sagittarius. While Jupiter is all about expansion and travel, Saturn is about restrictions and binding. As a result, Capricorn is the sign of responsibility, honor, and organization. In fact, even in tarot, the major arcana card ruled by Capricorn is the Devil, which, contrary to what you might expect, is actually about commitments and contracts. When it goes dark side, however, Capricorn can be pessimistic, condescending, insensitive, and most of all, unforgiving. One of my best friends is a Capricorn, so please you guys join the Discord because once she hears this, I might need new friends. Okay. In Greek mythology, Capricorn is often associated with Pan, the god of forests, woodlands, and flocks, and eventually the god of nature as a whole. He had the ears, horns, and lower body of a goat, and while he was always trying to chase pretty nymphs, they would run away from him out of fear of his appearance. One story I found was that in order to try and impress a water nymph, Pan dove into the ocean and tried to turn himself into a fish. However, he couldn't complete the transformation, and as a result, only his lower half was like that of a fish. This is why Capricorn is actually symbolized by a sea goat, not a mountain goat, as I originally thought. So anyway, Zeus found this accidental mermaid conversion so funny, he put Pan among the stars as the constellation of Capricorn. A completely different lore, however, relates the constellation to the goat nymph Amalthea, who suckled Zeus when he was a baby. As a show of gratitude, he immortalized her among the stars as the constellation of Capricorn. Capricorn is also linked to the Babylonian god Ea, who was the god of the seas, knowledge, wisdom, magic, and medicine, and had the upper half of a goat and the lower half of a fish. Okay, this video is super long already, I can already tell, so just a quick rundown of this painting. Here is Capricorn the Unforgiving. I've shown him to be a goat merman whose wrath has conjured up a devastating storm on the ocean. The story here is that his heir, a young prince, was brutally murdered by a proud, vicious king. In this rage, he has gone ahead and drowned said king in the water, his anger seeping into the very elements of nature. He holds the shattered remnant of this drowned king's crown, still deeply unsatisfied despite having claimed vengeance. If you follow this series closely, you can probably guess who the drowned king is, and if you know about the astrological signs and their polarities, you'll know exactly why I chose this particular sign to be the polarizing element here. And I also threw in a bit of Pan imagery with the goat and the mermaid, and some Zeus with the lightning. So finally, after all of this fantasy and lore, here is Capricorn the Unforgiving. So there we go. I hope this technique breakdown has helped you maybe rethink your own workflow a little bit and maybe consider integrating some of Abigail's steps into your own painting process. I know it's done that for me. Again, a massive thank you to Regina Tenorio and Louise Porter for requesting this video. I hope you guys find it helpful and enjoy watching it. And if you do, then please remember to give me a big thumbs up and leave a comment below. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell because I'm not trying to spoil anything, but I'm telling you, the next couple of videos for this month are gonna be in a similar vein. And if you're interested in more longer form intensive tutorials, then come check out my Patreon. I put a brand new super long tutorial on there every single week, so if you're interested in that, check that out. Link is in the description as well as in the cards above. But with all of that said, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I know it's been a long one, but I hope you've enjoyed it regardless. Check out some more videos up here, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!